So hello everyone. It's 4:35, so I think we can start. I will simply let Professor Dahlstrom start with his lecture. This is the third of 4 lectures on Ideas I, so he will resume from where he left off.
Okay, thank you again for the invitation to talk here, to speak with you. Again, thanks, Professor Ferrarin, for organizing this. The last 2 days we spent on the logical investigations, and so now we'll finally get to the topic of our meeting, the Ideas I. So my plan here is to go through the introduction with you and parts of the first section on essences and essential knowledge, and then the naturalistic misunderstandings. And that should set the stage for the second chapter, which is called the fundamental phenomenological consideration. And that's where he introduces the phenomenological reduction, the phenomenological attitudes, the natural attitude, and so on. So we'll try to get there today. If we don't, we'll get there next meeting. And as in our last meeting, if there are any particular passages or sections that you would like to talk about, please let me know, and I'll prepare them and be happy to go through them with you. It's a fairly long book. It has 4 sections, and what we're going to be able to go through is probably the first 2 sections. But there are some later discussions of noesis and noema, for example. If you'd like to talk about that, we certainly can. So start right in. If you have the Italian translation or my translation or another English translation, you'll probably be able to follow along, because I'm going to stick fairly closely to the text. So the complete title of the text is Ideas for a Pure Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy. That's the general title. Ideas for a Pure Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy. If you remember at the end of the Prolegomena, he talked about pure logic. So there is this sense of purifying logic and now purifying phenomenology from things that would adulterate it or make it or pollute it somehow. And clearly what is getting in the way of a pure phenomenology, as we'll see, is psychology, as it was in the Prolegomena. Now, ideas is the ideas that we'll be talking about today is book 1. And that's a good place to start, because he calls it General Introduction to Phenomenology, book 1. But it's the first of 3 books. Now, we'll talk very briefly, because he mentions it in the introduction, about books 2 and 3, but they aren't published until the early 1950s. And I think we mentioned last class, Merleau-Ponty got his hands on manuscripts to book 2. So we'll mention that in passing when we get there. But again, I'm going to be talking about the general introduction, which is this text. And it in many ways is his signature text. In it, he defines the key concepts and tasks, attitudes and methods of pure phenomenology. Okay. The introduction is worth a slow read. It's remarkable. It's lucid yet expansive. It's illuminating yet pointed. In it, he makes clear the bold philosophical ambitions of the work and the novelty of pure phenomenology in general. So I'm going to read the first 2 sentences. I'll read them slowly. Pure phenomenology is an essentially new science. By virtue of its very distinctiveness, it is one that lies far afield of natural thinking, and consequently presses now for the first time for development. Here, that is to say, in this first book, we are seeking the way into this science. We characterize its unique position relative to all other sciences and we aim to demonstrate it to be the fundamental science of philosophy. End of quote. So what's notable here is that the novelty he's claiming for phenomenology, a kind of esotericism. It's far afield from natural thinking, and its foundational role for philosophy. So dubbing phenomenology philosophy's fundamental science deserves some explanation, he concedes, since it calls itself a science of phenomena, but so do many other sciences. So he says, thus one hears psychology designated as science of mental appearances or phenomena, natural science a science of physical phenomena. So too there is talk from time to time of historical phenomena and history, of cultural phenomena in the sciences of culture, and similarly for every science of any reality. So all these sciences say that they're sciences of phenomena. So what's the deal? What is it that's so special about phenomenology? Husserl acknowledges this overlap, and it's not merely on the surface, but a substantial difference remains, and it consists in phenomenology's different attitude toward the phenomena. So he says, this is continuing in the introduction, however diverse the sense of the word phenomena in such talk, so phenomena in history, phenomena in psychology, phenomena natural sciences, however diverse the sense of the word phenomena in such talk, and whatever additional meanings it may have, one thing is certain, that phenomenology also relates to all these phenomena. Now, that's a bit surprising. Phenomenology is going to relate to all the phenomena that are supposedly the province of these various sciences. It relates to all these phenomena and does so in keeping with all the meanings of the term. So phenomenology is going to address the phenomena of physics, the phenomena of biology, the phenomena of psychology, the phenomena of history, or so he claims. Then he adds, however, it relates to them in a completely different attitude. By means of this attitude, every sense of phenomenon that we encounter in science as long familiar to us is modified in a specific way. It enters into the phenomenological sphere only to the extent that it is modified in this way. So here's that term that he'll be relying on, particularly the first couple sections of ideas, the word attitude. The German word is Einstellung. And for those who remember, when Hegel introduces the Encyclopedia Logic, he talks about 3 Einstellungen towards thinking, or 3 postures towards thinking. Could be translated 3 attitudes towards thinking. But it's that same word, Einstellung. So the entire argument of Ideas 1, at least the opening sections, turns on being able to adopt and describe the right attitude towards the phenomena. Okay. What modification the phenomenological attitude introduces and how it is achieved, he says, is the first task of phenomenology. The first task is to determine what this phenomenological attitude is and how to achieve it. So he says, continuing in the introduction, understanding these modifications, or the modifications of the attitudes, or to put it more precisely, achieving the phenomenological attitude, reflecting on its distinctiveness and that of the natural attitudes as a means of elevating them into scientific consciousness, that is the first and by no means easy task, the demands of which we have to satisfy completely if we want to acquire the basis of phenomenology and assure ourselves of its own distinctive essence scientifically. So the contrast he's developing here would be between natural attitudes and a phenomenological attitude. So the idea would be, as he's just said, to somehow what is present in the natural attitude to be able to elevate it to the phenomenological attitude. That's the task. We have a lot more to say about that, and we'll get to it. But any questions so far? Is that fairly clear? Okay. Now, these remarks are very general, and Husserl provides a glimpse of what he's talking about by glossing the talk of phenomenology among German philosophers and psychologists over the past decade. Despite presuming agreement with his logical investigations, that talk, he claims, he complains, that talk typically misconstrues phenomenology as the fundamental level of empirical psychology, where it means, quote, a sphere of immanent descriptions of mental experiences that remain strictly within the framework of inner experience. So the misconstrual is the way that Ernst Mach or Brentano understood the object of phenomenology. The immanent descriptions of mental experiences that remain strictly within the inner experience. So phenomenology, up to Husserl, we saw our first meeting together, there were many people referring to it, Lambert and Kant, Hamilton, where it was a study of appearances or illusions, what is present in inner experience, but isn't out there in the world. It's only describing what is proper to inner experience. And he complains that people were still using the word phenomenology that way, and they're even saying this is what Husserl meant in the logical investigations. He's not happy with that. They don't get it. They misconstrued what I'm talking about. So just for example, the categorical intuition, a concept we talked about last class. The categorical intuition, one of the objects of intuition is disjunctives. A or B or C or D. So the use of or in English is a disjunctive conjunction, a disjunctive connector. But the disjunct that my cap is either on the table or it's on the chair isn't about something going on in my head. The or is out there, and the categorical intuition puts us in contact with that disjunction in the world. It's either this or that. Or the cap and the book are on the table. That conjunction isn't something going on just in my head, although obviously I have to articulate it. It's something outside me. So he thought they just didn't get it. That when I was talking about categorical intuitions, for example, I was talking about something which is founded in reality that we have access to. So it's clear his annoyance in the introduction with this way in which phenomenology has been taken. Okay, he laments that his objections to them have been in vain, they've been misunderstood or carelessly shoved aside. He then adds, and this is worth noting, it's not perhaps as important as the rest of the context, but he says, the contemporaries have also missed the point of his critique of psychological method. The critique was not intended to deny the value of modern psychology or to denigrate the experimental work conducted by eminent psychologists. It was meant, however, to expose certain methodological deficiencies whose removal, in Husserl's view, would elevate psychology's credentials as a science. So he has nothing against doing something like the study of inner experience. He has nothing against experimental psychology, Wilhelm Wundt's school and all that. Nothing against that. Don't identify that with phenomenology. That's his problem. Okay. Yet, precisely because phenomenology continues to be misunderstood as a form of psychology, remember he identified the first edition of the logical investigations as descriptive psychology, so he abetted this approach. He now distinguishes phenomenology in no uncertain terms from psychology. Indeed, underscoring the distinction is at least one reason for deeming it pure phenomenology. It's pure of psychology. It's purified of the different kinds of methods which are associated with psychology. So if we wonder, what does that mean? What is the meaning of the ideas of a pure phenomenology? Well, one of them is it's not psychology, and we have to purify it of psychology in order for it to accomplish its task as being the foundational science of philosophy. Can't forget, this guy has big ambitions. I mean, he thinks he's doing something new that no one else has done before. And that if we don't do it, we're going to lose an adequate, accurate account of the validity of logic and the sciences. There's a lot at stake for him. Okay. He accordingly writes, in view of the prevailing and extremely influential misinterpretations, I touch on this dispute here in order to stress sharply from the outset that pure phenomenology, the path to which we want to establish in what follows, the same phenomenology that reached an initial breakthrough in the logical investigations, and whose sense became apparent to me in an increasingly rich and profound way over the last decade, is not psychology. Puts that all in italics, is not psychology. And what precludes it from being psychology is not an arbitrary matter of terminologies, but instead a matter of reasons based on principles. Although the methodological significance that phenomenology necessarily claims to have for psychology is enormous, so phenomenology is also going to address the foundations of psychology. Nonetheless, in addition, the foundations that it provides for psychology are essential. It is itself no more psychology than geometry is physics. So we remember that it was Mill and Sidgwick who said that logic is a part of psychology as I think it was chemistry is to physics, something like that. Now he's saying it's no more psychology than geometry is physics. Now, having said all that, we've already mentioned that he created some of these problems for himself by following the tradition of Brentano and others of describing logical investigations as descriptive psychology. Husserl can't ignore the fact that at the very least, the phenomena of psychology and those of phenomenology are designated by the same terms. So, okay, they're different, but we're both talking about perception. We're both talking about dreaming. We're both talking about imagining. Okay, so how do we make sure that they don't collapse into one another? What makes it even more difficult, I suppose, is he never gives up the parallel between these two sciences. He will, there's a 3-volume work of Husserliana from the mid-1920s called Phenomenological Psychology, which is supposed to be parallel to phenomenology. So the problem continues, even after the ideas won. Nevertheless, he contends that the fact that they describe phenomena in the same way, using the same words, this is at most a hindrance and not an indication of an identity. And he tries to face this head on here in the introduction, at least setting out his general approach. He writes, the fact that phenomenology deals with consciousness, with all kinds of experiences, acts, and correlates of acts, changes nothing in this regard, in regard to the fact that it's different from psychology. To appreciate this point requires, to be sure, considerable effort, given the reigning habits of thinking. To turn off previous habits of thinking in their entirety, to recognize and tear down the mind's barriers in which those habits envelop the horizon of our thinking, and then to apprehend with complete freedom of thinking the genuine problems, the philosophical problems that need to be posed in a completely new way. These are hard, exacting demands, yet nothing less is required. So he acknowledges that There's going to be this overlap of terminology, but what we need to do is shed these old habits that would make us think that the only way to study perception is psychologically. And this will require a great deal of effort. And part of the project of that effort is articulated in Ideas I. At this point, he reintroduces the concept of attitude. He now calls it a philosophical attitude. Now he's equating philosophy and phenomenology. They both have, he uses the adjectives in both cases to modify the attitude that we need to have that takes over from the natural attitude. The natural attitude is something we'll discuss pretty soon, because it's in the first chapter of Ideas I. So we'll get to that in just a moment. So he says, in what makes it so extraordinarily difficult to appropriate phenomenology's essence, to understand the distinctive sense of its problem and its relation to all other sciences, and including psychology, is that all of this requires a new kind of attitude, one that is completely changed from the natural attitudes of experience and thinking. Moreover, moving freely within the new attitude, I think you get the idea, he thinks that this is a liberating process, because we're used to just following the psychological paradigm. We're going to be liberated from that, and we're going to see new problems. We're going to see what the problems of philosophy are. Moving freely within the new attitude without falling back to the old attitudes, learning to see, to distinguish, and describe what is standing right before one's eyes, all this requires studies of a unique and arduous sort. Okay, so the introduction already tells us about this change in attitude that we have to undertake. Ideas I's premier task, he says, is to seek ways in which the enormous difficulties of penetrating into this new world can be overcome. One of the key ways of doing this is suspending the presuppositions of the natural attitude. So one of the ways to get into the phenomenological attitude is to suspend the presuppositions of the natural attitude. We'll talk about that. I hope we get to today. If not, we'll do it next meeting. But this suspension, this bracketing, this setting aside of the presuppositions of the natural attitude amounts to reducing consciousness to its pure phenomena. We're not describing those phenomena on the basis of the presuppositions of the natural attitude. This way of suspending the presuppositions of the natural attitude so that we free up the pure phenomena for phenomenology is what he calls a phenomenological reduction. So you're reducing the phenomena to simply what is given to us in consciousness, not presupposing that it's part of the natural world, which what the natural attitude supposes. So we also have in the introduction here the talk of reduction. So he is setting out pretty clearly what he's going to do in the book in the introduction. He writes as follows: we shall proceed from the natural standpoint, from the world as it stands opposite us, from consciousness as it presents itself in psychological experience, and expose the presuppositions essential to it. I'll go off script here for just a moment. There's a kind of Cartesian presumption in psychology that we have access to private states of mind, and those aren't in the world anymore. Oh, we can bypass that by saying it's part of the brain's interaction with the world. So these would be presuppositions of the natural attitude that we'd have to set aside to consider the phenomena on their own, without presuming. So I'll just presuppositions essential to the natural standpoint. We shall then develop a method of phenomenological reductions. Adhering to this method allows us to set aside the barriers to knowledge that are essentially part of every natural manner of research. Sidetrack the one-sided perspective proper to the latter. Okay, so here that he's playing phenomenological off of natural. Natural science is making presuppositions that get in the way of examining the phenomena on their own. That's the claim. Until finally we have managed to procure the free horizon of transcendentally purified phenomena, and with them the field of phenomenology in our distinctive sense of the term. So I think the key points of the introduction here is there are two kinds of attitudes. We have to somehow move from the natural attitude because it makes all kinds of philosophically unexamined presuppositions. We check, we set aside, we bracket those presuppositions for the sake of looking at the phenomena afresh, looking at them without those presuppositions. When we do that, we've adopted a phenomenological attitude, a philosophical attitude. But to do that, we've had to reduce what is present to us in our natural attitude, the way consciousness is present to us in the natural attitude. Okay, so from everything that we've reviewed up, it's clear that Husserl is preoccupied with differentiating pure phenomenology from psychology. Psychology is a science under the natural attitude. So that has to be set aside too. Okay, so drawing on these considerations, but with his eye still on the difference between psychology and phenomenology, he specifies the latter's connection to psychology. So the connection between psychology and phenomenology. This is a kind of a break in the introduction where he introduces the following terms. He's now going to describe psychology. And psychology is a science of experience. Let me throw this out here. The genitive here is meant in both ways, objective and possessive. The science will presuppose experience, and science will be a study of experience. So it's a dual kind of genitive. Sometimes like the city of New York, city, town, New York, it's in a positive genitive, and it captures both the possessive and the objective at once. That's sort of what's going on here. Also, the word experience here is following, which among phenomenologists in the early part of the 20th century was a way of describing experience as understood by empiricists. In contrast to another word translated as experience, in order to mark the difference in English, sometimes translators will translate this lived experience because the word for living somehow captured in erlebnis. Okay. Nevertheless, I mean, it's clear here he's been very clear that he's using the word erfahrung, not erlebnis. Now, this is the science of facts. And the word for facts there is Tatsachen. I won't write it on the board at the time. But it's interesting that Husserl occasionally uses English. This is a place where he uses English. And the expression he uses for facts here is and who is the person who gave us this expression in philosophy? Two operations of the understanding, relations of ideas, and okay, you don't want to impress me, so okay. So he mentions matters of fact, but that's what's meant by facts here. He mentions it in English, and he cites Hume. And I don't know enough about this. I know a little bit. I mean, in the early 19th century, a version of what was called associationist psychology was rampant. And the person who told us that there are laws of association in terms of which we can understand human consciousness is Hume. Identity, continuity in space and time, and causal continuity, causal connections. There were psychologists trying to understand inner experiences in terms of those three associationist principles. So Husserl's obviously not off here when he makes this point about the Humean influence on psychology. I think the German, Professor Farren can help me, but I think that the German most identified with that is Herbart, right? Herbart, yeah. Okay, and then he also describes it as a science of realities. The phenomena that it treats are real occurrences as such they have actual existence. They're part of, with real subjects, they're part of one spatio-temporal world as the sum of all reality. So that's what psychology, how he describes psychology in the introduction. By contrast, phenomenology is pure or transcendental phenomenology, and it is a science not of facts, but a science of essence. This is all from the introduction. He's making very clear that phenomenology is not psychology, and he's specifying in what way it's not psychology. It's not a science of experience, of facts, or realities. Phenomenology is a science of essences. This is also called eidetic science. Anybody want to help me out here? What would be an example of an eidetic science? Without even looking at Husserl. What is a science which is based on based on certain essences of things? It's mathematics. And for Husserl, particularly as mathematics inter with other disciplines, it's geometry. So it's not the individual, it's not this individual tool. This is, I mean, the marker or the way I think about it, that's the object of mathematics. It's the essence of two-ness, duality. So that's, Husserl started in mathematics. He slowly moved over to psychology in the late 19th century. But he has this sense of how mathematics works. It's a science of essences. And in a certain way, he's going to say that phenomenology is also a science. And we misconstrue it when we think of it as a science of experience, facts, or realities. So he says, it is a science that aims exclusively at securing knowledge of essences and no facts at all. The corresponding reduction that leads from the psychological phenomena, so there's a reduction that leads from psychology to the pure essence or that leads from the factual experience essentiality to the universality of an essence. This is, he calls now, an eidetic reduction. So this is a bit confusing because the first book of ideas is basically about essences and essential knowledge, and it isn't restricted to phenomenology. So mathematicians are working with pure essences, and that requires a reduction from the experience of numbers and the experience of geometrical figures to a consideration of the essences themselves. So he starts by talking about eidetic reductions, eidetic sciences in general, before he turns to phenomenology. That's the move from book 1 to book 2. Somebody, first name? Taya? Sarah. You were studying Ricerche. Yes. And Ricerche wrote a commentary on ideas. He translated Ideas 1, and then he wrote a commentary on it. And his advice, I may get this, don't quote me word for word, but something to the effect, start with chapter 2. Because chapter 1, he says in the very last section, these are, now that we've ended the logical considerations. So that's what I mean, the discussion of eidetic science in chapter 1, which we will look at, is not peculiar to phenomenology. If you want to see what's peculiar to phenomenology, you start with, I think this Ricerche said that you start with the second chapter, which I'm sure Husserl wouldn't have liked, because he wrote that chapter for a reason, to set the stage for understanding phenomenology as, like mathematics, an eidetic science. Okay. In similar fashion, Husserl distinguishes phenomenology from psychology as a science of the real. Here we come across terminology that if you've not seen it before, you may flinch a little bit, because it's very uncommon. In regard to this second point, the fact that psychology studies realities, the phenomena of transcendental phenomenology will be characterized as irreal. Here we've got realities, that's what psychology studies, phenomenology studies are irrealities. That's his expression for it. Other reductions purify the psychological phenomena of what lends them a reality, and thereby any fit or classification in the real world. Our phenomenology is to be a doctrine of the essences, not of real, but of transcendentally reduced phenomena. We're trying to understand the essence of perception and all that's built into the essence of perception. That's something irreal. It isn't here. It isn't on the table. It isn't around the corner. It's an irreality, the essence of perception. If we want to understand perception in a way that doesn't reduce it to a fact or a reality or a particular experience, then we have to use another term. That's the term that he adopts, irreality. It will be apparent further that all transcendentally purified experiences, so all experience, all reductions of the experience are irrealities, set outside any fit or classification in the actual world. Phenomenology, he says, investigates these very irrealities, not as singular individualities, but instead in terms of their essences. You can see what problems this is going to lead to. They're going to say, well, how is this not idealism of a icky sort? Aren't you reintroducing? You're not saying it's part of the actual world. Husserl doesn't bother. He thinks that we first need to describe these transcendentally purified phenomena, these experiences, and the metaphysics will come later. And we can't let a presumption about the metaphysics foreclose the investigation. I mean, just ask yourself, just to play devil's advocate with Husserl here for a moment. The Pythagorean theorem, it says something essential about triangles, doesn't it? Seems to. Does it only do it as long as we think about it? Did it not hold before we were born? Will it not hold after we die? It's not a fact of the world. It's not part of the actual world. Or if it is, it's going to come and go. But it doesn't. Now, we may have trouble figuring out where we're going to put these things called numbers. Where we're going to put these things called triangles. Where we're going to put these things called the essence of perception. But we can't presume that it's something real if that rules out its transcendental, its essential character. So Husserl struggles with this the rest of his life, and both Husserlians and anti-Husserlians struggle over whether this is a kind of, opens the door to a kind of idealism or not. But I think in his own defense, he's saying, well, if you describe the experience of these eidetic sciences, they're not the science of anything real in the world, in the actual world. I suppose we could do a Platonic Aristotelian debate here. We could say, well, aren't these abstracted from things we experience in the world? But then one has to presuppose that things in the world are instances of this general essential structure in order for the abstraction to work. So it's not so easy to get rid of essences. And that's something that he's counting on here. There's eidetic sciences, and it'll turn out that phenomenology is an eidetic science. Science of essences, again, not of experience, not of matters of fact, not of realities. But you're only going to get to the eidetic science if you begin with those. That's the other side of the flip of the coin. Okay. Any comments or questions? I've been just jumping around here. Yep. Okay. So I'll just end this now with the discussion of the introduction. As I mentioned, there's 3 books. This one came out in 1913. The book 2 and book 3 were published in the 1950s, early 1950s. God, I forget the fellow's name who edited them, a very nice man. Anyway, Merleau-Ponty had access to the manuscripts on the basis of which book 2 was eventually edited. But here's what he says about book 1, and then I'll just gloss what he says about book 2 and 3. In this first book, we shall not only treat the general doctrine of phenomenological reductions that render transcendently purified consciousness and its essential correlates visible and accessible to us, we also want to undertake to present in a determinate way the most general structure of this pure consciousness. And by this means to present the most general groups of problems, directions of investigation, and methods that belong to this new science. I think that's, for those of you interested in contemporary philosophy of mind, this text has a lot to look for with regard to the nature of consciousness. It's an attempt to articulate pure consciousness and the structures within pure consciousness. Now, in the second book, he treats a group of problems at the juncture of phenomenology and various sciences. And he says that by showing this connection between phenomenology and the various sciences, we considerably deepen the understanding of phenomenology in the first book. So in the second book, you will have discussions of the body. You have discussions of the I can, the potential to act. You'll have discussions of motivation, that's supposedly not non-causal motivation. And these, of course, will have a bearing on a number of different disciplines. So there's no question that it deepens our understanding of what's in the first book. The third book is devoted to the idea of philosophy. And he says explicitly metaphysics and its rooting in pure phenomenology. Okay. Everything, including metaphysics, is going to be based upon this new science called phenomenology. Okay. there are no questions, that's all about the introduction. But I think it's good. It gives you an overview of what the text is about, what he's after. So now I'm going to go through a number of sections of subsections of the first section on essence and essential knowledge. I have an Italian friend back in the States, and I said, yeah, I'm giving these lectures, but they don't ask many questions. And he says, the Italian students don't ask questions. They sit back there and they're thinking how they're going to destroy your arguments. But they're not going to tell you face to face. They're going to do it later. Anyway, so essence and essential knowledge. You can see that this isn't peculiar from his point of view to phenomenology. He starts off by talking about natural knowledge and experience. The word experience there is again erfahrung, not Erlebnis. So natural knowledge, this is a term he introduces. We know that natural in these opening sections is always going to be played off phenomenology, played off against phenomenology. But he says natural knowledge starts with experience and remains in experience. The italicized in underscores the sort of knowledge in question and its limits, pointing to knowledge of another sort, namely knowledge of ideas. In the natural attitude, which he now equates with theoretical and original attitude, the entire horizon of possible lines of research is the world. And the sciences pursued with this attitude are sciences of the world. These are sciences of real being, or being in the world. Each science has its region of objects determining its research, as well as certain intuitions in which those objects are given in an originary way. The intuition that affords these objects, making up the natural sphere of knowledge, is natural experience. And the experience that affords them in an originary way is perception. We experience physical things in this originary way in outer perception, and we similarly experience ourselves and our states of consciousness in so-called inner or self-perception. So the world, this is an interesting contrast with Heidegger. The world seems to be the sum total of objects of possible experience. It also includes the sciences of the world. Sciences belonging to the natural attitude are called sciences of nature. So, natural attitude on the basis of it, we perceive things in the world. This perception leads to let's see, how did I want to say that? Sciences of nature. And here he says in the narrow and broad sense. Now, what does that mean? He means it extends from the sciences of material nature, so physics, to psychophysical, zoology, biology, botany, and then to psychological science. So I would take it that the narrow sense would be physics, material nature, and then the broader sense would be psychology. One thing he doesn't talk about here is the difference between what the Germans debated quite a bit in the early 20th century, the distinction between Geisteswissenschaft and the Naturwissenschaft. So sciences of the human spirit and sciences of nature. He doesn't take a position on that. But he does broadly say that the humanities would also, as a science, would also fall under the sciences of nature. They would also be the product of the natural attitude. And that's really one of the places where phenomenology is more immediately going to have an impact, because it's going to try to talk about meanings that can't be understood as part of nature. So that at least looking ahead, that's something that we can see will change. But at least in the opening section here, he simply wants to talk about the natural attitude. Science is based upon it, and it includes everything that is part of nature. And of course, we're part of nature. So anthropology, culture, can be also understood as part of nature. Okay. Now, having introduced this notion of natural knowledge, he introduces the notion of essence. I'm very unsatisfied with this, but I'll read it to you, go through it with you. He says, all experiential sciences are sciences of fact, of facts. They posit existing spatio-temporal individuals. And each of these individual realities is contingent. Okay. So I was born probably 30 years or maybe 20 years before anyone else in this room. Did I have to be born? Unless you're Spinoza, you can say, no, I might just as well have never existed. I'm contingent. Did the Leaning Tower of Pisa have to be? Contingent. Did Pisa have to lose the war to Florence, I learned today, in whatever century it was? Didn't have to happen. It's contingent. Everything in nature, it seems, every individual reality is something that didn't have to be. It is, but it didn't have to be. Now, Husserl has this kind of reflection. He says, each of these individual realities is in a certain way, but it could, in keeping with its essence, be otherwise. This very contingency is related to a necessity that is an essential necessity, which is not to be identified with factual regularity of the connection between spatio-temporal facts. So it is not only a fact that I was born 30 years before everyone else in this room, it's essential that I didn't have to be born then, but was born. So he says, when we said that each fact in keeping with its own essence could be otherwise, we already expressed thereby that it just is part of the sense of everything contingent to have an essence, and thus an eidos that is to be grasped purely. And this eidos stands then under the truths of essences at various levels of universality. So we can flip our attention from the fact to the essence that makes the fact contingent. And it's the essence that characterizes the fact. Okay. Dahlstrom's a human being. Human beings don't have to be, didn't have to come to be. It's essential to them that they didn't have to come to be. So every fact has a corresponding essence, and essences have to be, certain essences, material essences have to be instantiated in facts. Okay, another example he gives, each sound has an essence, and in addition, a supreme essence, the general essence of sound. Facts and essences are inseparable from one another. Whatever belongs to the essence of one individual, it is possible for some other individual to possess. Okay, so this way he introduces the distinction, excuse me. The inseparability you can see why he has this idea of the promise of phenomenology, providing the foundation for philosophy and for all sciences. If phenomenology is going to be a study of the essences, and we now see that we can't talk about facts without essences. But that's the case, you can see where he starts to have this confidence in this project. Okay. Now, the next point he makes along these lines is, just as there is for every fact an essence that determines the nature of the fact, what it is, we have to then have some corresponding way of perceiving it. So if essences must be countenanced, if we have to accept them, if there's something essential about factuality, then the question arises of how they are known. In general, essence signifies what an individual inherently is, and insofar as it does so, it has the potential to signify what another individual is as well. While we generally begin with individual or experiential intuition, it's always possible for the latter to be transformed into an instance of seeing the essence, the ideation, on some level or another. So I look at this, and I see a drawing of a triangle. I see an individual contingent thing put on the board. But I can switch to consider what essence this is an instantiation of, triangularity. Now, the point he's making in this regard is not so easy to accept. He wants to say that just as there is a individual, sure I don't fall off the text too much here, individual intuition, so there is an intuition of the essence. And he uses pretty much the traditional language here. He'll either say, Shalom, or Anshalom. So we see the essence of triangles just in a parallel way to the way we see individual triangles. And in both cases, it has to be something intuitive, it has to be something that is in that sense given to us. We don't construct the concept of, we can construct the concept of triangularity, but on the basis of the meaning of triangularity that we see, that's given to us. I mean, I hate to use that word again, our intuitions run against this. We tend to use the word intuition to talk about visual seeing. Not completely. I mean, there's Bergson, was around at this time, and other people who were talking about eidetic intuitions, but it's a stretch for our ordinary use of the term intuition. Or the German Anschauung means to look upon, or to look at, or to observe. Intuition might be even too technical a translation of it. But the idea that we could look on or observe in essence is, I think, somewhat counterintuitive, pardon my use of intuitive. Okay. But this is what he means by ideation. So the title of this book is Ideas, and the shift from the individual intuition to the essential intuition is what he calls ideation. So now we're considering ideas. And this is also a continuation of this notion of intuition. So the central point here is that the turn from intuiting the individual to seeing an essence has the character of an affording giving act. Okay, so this is his language that it is something given to us. It's not something we construct. The number system, as we consider its elements, is not invented. It's discovered. The symbolism can be invented. Different symbolism can be invented, but there are some kinds of character to numbers that is given. And that's what's meant by the eidetic intuition. So he stresses that. The eidos is an object of a new kind. The essence is an object of a new kind. I hope I need to put that. So the essence is the object of the intuition. Just as the given in the individual or experiencing intuition is an individual object, so the given in the intuition of the essence is a pure essence. This is a reworking of the distinction between straightforward and categorical intuitions in the sixth logical investigation. So there's a continuity there in this regard. I'll just repeat a few things. He says, just as an individual is the object given or afforded in person, Professor Farran used this the first day of our meetings, leibhaftig, in person. Just as the individual is the object given or afforded in person in an empirical intuition, so the essence is the object that is itself apprehended in person in the corresponding intuition. And that, of course, is not so obvious because leibhaftig means in the flesh. And sure, you're given to me in the flesh, I'm given to you in the flesh, but is my humanity given to you in the flesh? He's saying, yeah. Thus, the intuition of an essence is not some vague envisaging, Vergegenwärtigung, but a discernment. I use the word entschauen in the precise sense of the term, affording the essence in no less an originary way. But then he covers himself and said, yet it, as an intuition, it's also intrinsically unique and novel. So he wants to both stress this commonality between individual sensory intuitions, where the object is an individual object, and the intuition of essences. They're common. He's using the same verb, the same act of accessing it, but yet at the same time he wants to say the eidetic intuition is unique and novel. Okay. He adds here something we've mentioned in passing. What is certain is that as a consequence of these reflections, one cannot have an intuition of an essence without being able to shift one's focus freely toward a corresponding individual and form a consciousness of an example. Okay? So you're always free to go from triangularity to something like that and form a consciousness of an example. Just as conversely, one cannot have an intuition of something individual without freely being able to form an idea of it and focus in the idea and the corresponding essence that is exemplified in what is individually visible. So we can start with these triangles and then go to the corresponding essence. So mentioned already this inseparability. Let's just add a couple other words there. Separability. There's also similarity, and I think the similarity is perhaps best captured by the givenness. They're both given, they're not constructed, they're not made up, they're not invented, and yet they're different. Not a contradiction. They're similar in one way and different in another. But you have to recognize, he thinks, they're inseparable, there's something common, and yet they're different. These two kinds of intuitions, individual intuition and the intuition of an essence. Another way to put this, individual, this is another way to put it, nothing special. Should be, for example, A is F. And here you would switch F nets. You always have this individual F, and then you can switch from the individual to the F-ness that is instantiated. There, you can always go switch back and forth. Now, he adds a very important point that we mentioned last meeting with regard to the logical investigations, but it's spelled out here very explicitly in section 4, and that is the role of fantasy. He says the pure essence can just as well exemplify itself in what is given in the imagination or fantasy as in what is given in intuition, in perception. Okay. So what's the difference between a scalene triangle and a right triangle? What does a scalene triangle look like? I'm asking, I don't remember. So the isosceles would be like that, right? What is the scalene? Yeah, good, okay. Now you did this, thank you, that's very helpful. But you didn't have to do that. It's because Dahlstrom doesn't understand triangles that you had to do that. But you were able to imagine it without doing that. So there he had in the imagination, in fantasy, an instantiation of the essence of triangularity. And we can, he says, we can just as well exemplify the essences in imagination or fantasy as in perception. Positing and apprehending essences by way of initially intuiting them does not in the least imply a positing of any kind of individual existence. Pure truths of essences do not contain any claim about facts at all. From truths about essences, no factual truths can be derived. To ground claims about facts, experience is required. To ground claims about pure essences, intuitions are required. Intuitions of essences are required. Okay, I'm going to skip the next part. I don't think it's particularly interesting, but he makes a distinction between grasping an essence where we say any triangle is such and such. So any triangle has angles whose sum is 180 degrees, any triangle. Or saying the essence of a triangle is to be such and such. And he says these are two different ways of making judgments about essences. In one, it's the object. In the other, it allows us to talk about any triangle or any square, or any circle. But I don't think anything rides on that, and other than there's these two different ways of talking about our access to essences. If you want to look at it up, it's section 5 of the first part of Idee I. Okay, so we could continue here. The sciences of facts and the sciences of essences exhaust the kinds of sciences there are. The sciences of facts are based on individual intuitions. The example he gives is physics. Not sure if that works today, but that's what he gives. And then the sciences of essences are eidetic intuitions. The example there he gives is geometry. So he has a longer list: logic, mathematics, the doctrine of time and space, the doctrine of motion are pure sciences of essences. They posit no facts, and no experience can provide a grounding. You have to remember, experience here is understood in the empiricist sense as something which is distinguished in space and time and is causally related to other experiences. The irrelevance of the geometer's drawing of figures on the blackboard, or at least for the geometer's seeing of the essences, is obvious. Okay. I mean, that one I drew on the board, I could draw 20 others, doesn't matter. Okay. It doesn't have any effect on it's irrelevant to seeing what the essence of triangle is. By contrast to the geometer, the physicist observes and experiments, ascertaining existence experientially. And this provides a justification for which no imagining can substitute, he says. Hence, the concepts of a science of facts and the science of experience are equivalent. And I think I'll skip over that. Okay, just add a few more words to the this opening section. He talks about a relation of dependency between sciences of facts and sciences of essences. But we already know that he doesn't think that sciences of essences are dependent on sciences of facts. That should be obvious. Geometry is not based on any facts about the world. Whereas eidetic sciences must be independent from factual science, he says no science can be independent of eidetic science, whether the latter be formal or material. So what he means by this, so there's no sciences of facts that are independent of eidetic sciences. Eidetic sciences, in turn, are independent of sciences of facts. What he means by that requires us to talk about something he hasn't fully introduced yet, and that is the distinction between formal and material disciplines. So, empirical science sciences of facts are going to presuppose eidetic sciences, but the reverse doesn't hold. Now, in what way do they presuppose it? Well, that's pretty obvious. Empirical science, in conformity to pure logic. And pure logic is an eidetic science. So, you have to ask yourself, if somebody who's talking about experience, telling us the results of an experiment, contradict themselves and say, whoa, that doesn't work. If you get in the laboratory to me, do it logically. So the empirical science presupposes the eidetic science of logic. It also presupposes something we haven't mentioned yet, and we mentioned in passing a couple of classes ago. That is formal ontology. It's a little more elusive, but it's pretty clear. If you say that the temperature of the water placed in a certain condition changed rapidly, the condition of the water, the temperature of the water is a property of the water. The concept of property is not tied to physics. It's part of a formal ontology. So the concept of property, the concept of a state of affairs, the concept of a relation. There's a debate about how far this reaches, but these are formal concepts that are presupposed by the empirical science, but are not themselves studied by the empirical science. There's logic, so there's formal ontology. We'll say a little bit more about it in a moment. I mean, the most obvious concept in formal ontology is the concept of object, something. But then if you say it has a property or it's related to something else, or it's in a configuration in a state of affairs, these are all formal ontological concepts. Yeah.
I don't know what the connection or distinction between pure logic and formal ontology, because it seems similar.
Okay, let me just try it to give you an example of it. So, let's see. So in logic, I would say S and F, okay? So let's say that this stands for conjunction. Conjunction of S and F. Okay? So this would be a logical relationship. Actually, let me change. Let me make it simpler. Just write PQ. Okay. That stands for P and Q. That's a logical relation. Okay. Corresponding to this logical relation, that logical connection, ontologically is a relation. So let's say that P stands for the book is on the table. Q stands for the cap is on the table. Logical relationship is P and Q are this proposition, this sentence, in conjunction with this sentence, forms a conjunction. What it stands for can be expressed in purely formal terms. Ignore the fact that its idea is one, ignore the fact that it's the St. Louis Cardinals cap. Ignore all that, but we still have a relation between two objects. This would be formal ontology. Does that help?
So the formal ontology, that means that these two together.
It's an expression of what there is in abstract terms that has to be filled in by material ontology, by matters of the world. But we can, when we do express a theory, we're presupposing some kind of ontological concepts in general. And that would be, this is one prime example. Here's another example. Stumpf introduced the term state of affairs, which is now used all over philosophy, analytic and continental philosophy. So a state of affairs would be, for example, the car is slow. The logical expression of this state of affairs, we're talking about the car, and let's say the car is slow. So we express it like C stands for the object, and S stands for the property of the object. So the logical expression SC or FX corresponds to a state of affairs in which the car's relation to certain properties is articulated. Does that help?
So here, logical relationship goes inside the expression in formula, because it divides exactly to the formal ontology.
Yeah, I mean, Wittgenstein is another way to put this. So he uses state of affairs too. And so the state of affairs corresponds to a proposition, and names correspond to objects. So the naming would be the logical concept, and the object would be the formal ontological concept in Wittgenstein. I think in the Tractatus is actually where he mentions this. So it's a parallel between the formal terminology of setting up what the laws of inference are, that's logic, and the formal ontology is giving an abstract account of the ways of talking about beings in general. I lost you, still don't have it. I mean, this is just at a level of abstraction. This is simply an abstraction from the relation between words and propositions. Whereas this is a statement of the kinds of things there are at a very abstract level. But you would want there to be a parallel here. And that's why it's important in the Tractatus that you have that parallel between F is A, where A is the name stands for an object, F stands for the object is outside. So it would just describe something about the object, but you would want the logical terminology to match it. And Husserl has that. He's working with a similar sort of thing. Okay, I think I'm going to move on. Okay, I'll try to talk to you more. Great. So, so back to our discussion. Empirical science presupposes a logic and formal ontology, and then he also says. Sorry. It also presupposes some essential material content. In the interest of time, I'm probably not going to go into this, but this is also described as material ontology. So there would be some conception of what it means to be an organism. That would be material ontology presupposed by the empirical science of biology. That'd be an example. So there'd be some essential material content to the concepts that are used to study facts. So in both of these senses, empirical science would be dependent on sciences of essences. Now you ask, is this happening? Does this really work? And yeah, it's controversial, but Husserl thinks that the use of geometry in physics over the centuries, the increasing use of geometry in physics over the century, is an example of what he's talking about. So the development of what he calls the rational natural sciences through their use of geometry. He writes, it becomes clear that it is the essence of the material thing to be res extensa. That by this means geometry is the ontological discipline relevant to an inherently essential aspect of this kind of thing, the form of space. So geometry becomes one of these disciplines that provides the concepts that make up the essential material content for the empirical science. So he thinks that the incorporation of geometry into physics is an example of what he has in mind. It's pretty clear that that reference to res extensa, he has Descartes in mind. Just say two more things. Every science of facts has essential theoretical foundations in eidetic ontologies. His paradigm is the eidetic science of physical nature, which corresponds to all natural scientific disciplines. So there's some essence of nature in general that is presupposed by the empirical disciplines. Now, what is that essence? True phenomenology. You have to end up coming back here to determine what the essences are that are presupposed by the empirical disciplines. Of course, you don't need to do that to do biology, the way biology is conducted. But if you want to have a philosophically responsible biology, then you're going to have to do phenomenology as he understands. Because phenomenology is the science of essence. Yeah. Yeah.
Geometry not part of empirical.
Right. Right.
But it's kind of material content or a formal ontology.
No, I think he thinks that geometry provides the material content for space as presupposed by the study of physics. So there's a sense in which physics study of motion, matter, is going to suppose the eidetic science of space. That's not the same as pure ontology, because this is talking about, for example, we no longer think that Euclidean space, that geometry is the most important. We have another one, but that is presupposed by the study of physical nature. And it's not provided by pure logic or formal ontology. It's a separate eidetic science, the science of non-Euclidean geometry or curvilinear space.
Relations part of the empirical science.
The empirical science presupposes concepts of space and time.
Yes.
It presupposes concepts of space-time. And according to Husserl's account, those would be eidetic sciences of space and time and space-time. The person who came up with space-time, Hermann Weyl, was in his classroom in the 20s. So it's an interesting scientist too. Okay, I think we probably need to take a break. You've been listening to my voice too long. I'm going to just say one more thing about chapter 1 on essential knowledge after the break. And then I'm going to move to the naturalistic misconceptions. The most important section in there is what he calls the principle of all principles. Like the war of all wars, it's the principle of all principles. Heidegger says, well, if it's the principle of all principles and all the principles are theoretical, that principle can't be theoretical. We'll talk about that afterwards. Okay. 10 minutes, maybe. No.
From this, we separately move from because I consider conflicts about these separately because sometimes they kind of construct forms, especially mathematical forms, examples of existence.
Yeah.
Yes, so here is the factual equation. It only has and then not based on things.
I see there are some that may not be or that's not really. Yeah.
The arts theory but is constructed by our mind, so it doesn't have any.
Well, that's a good question, but he thinks that imagination and its can be exemplification of that.
Yes, but I'm certainly from the identity bonus. The existence of okay.
Okay, there's just one point that may be worth mentioning here at the end of first section, and that is the distinction between generalization and formalization. So the formalization has to do with formal ontology again. So the idea here is, I think, pretty simple, but he does spell it out. Being red and being triangular are essences of being red and being triangular essences. And they belong to the wider genus of sensible quality. So red belongs to the wider genus of sensible quality. Being triangular belongs to the wider genus of spatial shape. So they're both, you can see both of them as species that belong under the genus. Okay. So, but both being red and being triangular are essences. Okay. So that, in that sense, they can also be subsumed under the category of essence in some sense. Okay. So being red falls under the genus of being a sensible quality. Being triangular falls under the sensible species of being a spatial shape. But they also fall under the category of essence. When they fall into the category of essence, that's on the side of formal ontology or formalization. It's not a material ontological subsumption. So he wants to keep those two separate, generalization and formalization. So he says, just repeat it, while both being red and being triangular are essences, and hence can also be subsumed under the category of essence in some sense, it would be absurd to construe essence as the genus of material essences, specified by being red and being triangular, in the same way that the latter specify material essences of sensible quality and spatial shape. So he wants to distinguish what you might call the hierarchy of genus and species in material ontology from a hierarchy in formal ontology. But there'll be going to be some overlap because you're going to talk about genus, species, you're going to talk about essences under the generalization, but the full account of the essences would have to fall under the formalization, formal ontology. I don't know if that helped, but there is a distinction there that he's going to use. There's a lecture by Heidegger in 1919 where he accuses Natorp of not knowing the distinction between generalization and formalization. It's an interesting criticism because there you're conflating what is purely formal generality with a material generality. So, okay. Now the next section, we only have time for this, but we have enough time to go into it. This is called naturalistic misconceptions. And the word naturalistic here is used just as it is today. It's used in the sense that all that there is part of nature as studied by the natural sciences. Bingo, over, game over, that's it. Okay. So Husserl obviously is going to be criticizing this. So naturalism, he calls it naturalistic misconceptions. Now, before he does that, he says some things which sound perhaps a bit pretentious, but he says up to this point, so this is the second chapter of the book, I've made no use of philosophical doctrines that have been passed down to us. Not so sure, but nevertheless, that's what he says. His method has been to carry out principled expositions, giving faithful expression to distinctions that are directly given in intuition. Then he says, we have presupposed nothing, not even the concept of philosophy, and we want to keep it like this in what follows. So this later is a subject of criticism, Heidegger, the so-called presuppositionlessness. Can you really be presuppositionless? Okay. Now, despite having said that about we have presupposed nothing, and there's no philosophy at work here, we're just trying to pay attention to the givens. He says, even though we must avoid speaking of philosophy at all, we do need to engage in dispute with empiricism. And what forces this upon us, he says, is the fact that empiricism denies essences, ideas, and knowledge of essences. So he's going to break his rule and he's going to engage in philosophy and engage with a counter philosophy, one that denies essences, ideas, and knowledge of essences. Now, how does empiricism get motivated? What gets it started? He actually thinks that it gets started for admirable motives. He says the most estimable motives lie behind empiricism. Its insistence upon returning to the things themselves and the experience of them in place of all opinion and prejudice. But empiricism takes genuine science and science of experience to be one and the same, and accordingly rules out any talk of essences or ideas that are not found in experience. Right? I'm sure if you had to teach Hume's inquiry or treatise in the history of modern to students, and they ask about, well, where does geometry fit here? Where does algebra fit? And it's not clear you're going to be able to get this just out of identity and inference patterns, as Hume suggests in the relations of ideas. So it is a kind of a problem with how mathematics works for the empiricists. So Husserl writes, ideas, essences, in contrast to facts. What would they be other than scholastic entities, metaphysical ghosts? To have saved humanity from this sort of philosophical spook is precisely the chief contribution of modern natural science. If something is not really actual and cannot be experienced, science has nothing to do with it. So he's characterizing that motivation behind empiricism and to some extent behind modern natural science. But then he immediately adds, the mistake here, the misconception here, is the demand that knowledge be justified in every instance by experience. Husserl writes, but things are not without further ado things of nature. Actuality in the usual sense is not without further ado actuality in general. And of the acts that afford things in an originary sense, the one that we call experience refers only to the actuality of nature. So he says that the empiricists have limited the given to the givens of nature, to experience insofar as it presents us with individual realities. Consider, for example, the truths of mathematics, truths about numbers, the essence of the Pythagorean theorem. These truths are objects of discernment, Erschauung, not experience. So Husserl charges that the empiricist presupposition of the equation of all things with things of nature is a prejudice, not afforded by consideration of the material itself. Immediately seeing, and he puts seeing in quotation marks, not merely sensory, experiential seeing, but seeing in general, that is, any kind of consciousness that affords something in an originary way, is the ultimate source of legitimacy of all rational claims. It has this legitimizing function only because and insofar as it affords something in an originary way. So that's, we're seeing where that's going. That's this notion of the eidetic intuition. He says a little later, if positivism means nothing less than an absolutely unprejudiced grounding of all sciences on the positive, on what is given in an originary way, then we, the phenomenologists, are the genuine positivists. Because we're the ones paying attention to the givens and not restricting it prejudicially, preemptively to the givens of nature. So most of this, as we've seen, has been in a rebuttal of a sort of empiricism. But he also introduces a reproach from the side of Platonic realism. He notes that the charge of Platonic hypostasizing is off target, given his clear demarcation of being an object from being real. And he says, I did not invent this use of object or the different ways that something ideal is an object. So he writes, if object and real, actuality and real actuality are one and the same, then the construal of ideas as objects and actualities is, to be sure, an absurd Platonic hypostasizing. So if object and real actuality are one and the same, that construing ideas as objects and actualities is Platonic hypothesizing. It's absurd. If, however, both are sharply separated, as was done in the logical investigations, if object is defined as anything at all, such as subject of a true assertion, what offense can remain unless it be of the sort that stems from obscure prejudices? He goes on to say that he didn't invent the talk of something ideal, or the talk of the object of a proposition as something ideal. And then he goes on to say the blindness to ideas is a kind of blindness of the soul. And the title of the book is Ideas. Ideation is where this shift from the natural attitude to the phenomenological attitude. Thanks to prejudices, one has become incapable of bringing into the field of judgment what one has in one's field of intuitions. In truth, everyone sees ideas, sees essences, and sees them, so to speak, all the time. Everyone operates with ideas and essences in thinking, and they also make judgments about essences. Only from an epistemological standpoint do they interpret these judgments away. So just to take a couple of examples, a categorical intuition. The intuition that the chair is behind the table. You see that the chair is behind the table. That's seeing a state of affairs. That's not seeing a color, simply. But that's what he means. We see states of affairs when we use logic. We think if P, then Q, P therefore Q. P stands for the same thing each time. We're talking about an ideal actuality, not something in nature. So we see when we're thinking about something and we're recalling what we thought about it the last time we thought about it, there's some kind of ideal essence there that we're comparing with our present consideration of it. So I think that's what he means, that we see essences, ideas all the time. And it's only this empiricist prejudice or a Platonic prejudice that would make us think that we don't. Ideas, he says, once again, citing what he sees as a prejudice, he recounts how their blindness leads them to construe essences as concocted phenomena, concepts in the sense of psychological creations or mental constructs. Husserl writes, ideas or essence, it is said, are thus concepts, and concepts are mental constructs, products of abstraction. And as such, they play, to be sure, a large role in our thinking. Essence, idea, or eidos, these are noble philosophical names for sober psychological facts. He's caricaturing this position, this position he's opposing. So you notice here, he is avoiding word concept and using the word ideas or eidos or essence, because the concept is too readily understood as a mental construct. Now, why avoid that? Well, we avoid that because the whole notion of an intuition is that the object of the intuition, whether it's you hearing my voice right now or thinking of that triangle earlier, is not constructed, but given. So it's crucial that we don't lose sight of this, at least to follow his argument, maybe reject the argument at the end. But the essence is like individual objects are things given. They're not reducible to mental constructs. So it's a theory of ideas, a theory of essences, and he's trying to avoid using the word concept for this very reason. Sometimes he does use it, of course, but can't get away without it. But in that sense, he's trying to avoid it. Here's a nice little sentence or two from Husserl about, you get the flavor of his thinking here. A representation of a number is not a number itself. It is not the tool, this sole member of the series of numbers. The member that, like all such members, is a non-temporal being. To designate it as a concept, as a mental construct, is accordingly absurd. So just see that, a representation of a number. One representation is writing the number on the board. That's a representation of a number. Or we can represent or imagine it to ourselves. The representation of a number is not a number itself. To designate it as such is absurd, an offense against the completely clear sense of arithmetical discourse. Discourse that is always discernible as valid prior to all theories. Again, discernible is the word for intuitable. Now, one might object that essences are abstracted and imagined, similar to arbitrary fictions. Here he talks about the flute-playing centaur that we imagine. But Husserl points out that the centaur is not mental. It is purely imagined, not to be confused with the imagining of it. So too in the case of the spontaneous abstraction, not the essence, but the consciousness of it is something generated. Hence, it's simply a confusion to take the consciousness of the essence for the essence. You see how far this goes. I mean, even consciousness, the consciousness of the essence isn't the same as the essence. The essence is given to consciousness. Okay, now this brings us to the, as I suggested earlier, the most cited part of the Ideas I, most infamous statement in this discussion, what he calls I think you could safely say that this principle, the endorsement of it, the application of it, is the mark of a phenomenologist. Something like this. So it's a very useful way to characterize what phenomenology is about. This is its criterion. This is its measuring stick. It's Maßstab. So I'm going to read it slowly. It's not that long, but it's more than a sentence or two. No conceivable theory can make us stray from the principle of all principles, that each intuition that affords something in an originary way is a legitimate source of knowledge. That whatever presents itself to us in intuition, in an originary way, in its actuality in person, is to be taken simply as what it affords itself as, but only within the limitations in which it affords itself there. Let us continue to recognize that each theory in turn could itself draw its truth only from originary givennesses. The word givenness here in German is gegeben, Gegebenheit, but our university has just built this incredible building. I mean, it's like 8 stories high and it blocks the view to Harvard. And anyway, it's a huge building. It's the center of data sciences. They put all this money into data sciences. Sciences of data. What does data mean? The past participle of the given. It's the givens. Now you got to know how to interpret the givens, but you got to have the givens to interpret. So there's this center of data sciences. It's all across the globe. Of course, there's the study of big data, artificial intelligence, the study of all this. But it all comes down to something given. Something has to be given that then is interpreted. So the question is, well, what are the givens? And that's what phenomenology is in part about, to determine what are the givens. And given essentially, as a result of this dance we do here with the reductions. So again, let us continue to recognize that each theory in turn could itself draw its truth only from originary givenness. It's not, if it doesn't do that, it's fabricated, it's made up. It has to recognize, it has to trace its theories back to something given. Thus, every assertion that does nothing further than give expression to such givennesses through mere explication and meanings conforming precisely to them is, as we put it in the introduction, an absolute beginning, calling upon to lay ground in the genuine sense, a principium. This holds in particular measure, however, for the general knowledge of essences, knowledge of the kind for which the word principle is usually restricted. So with these originary givenesses, we have an absolute beginning of science. All sciences have to be traced back to these absolute givenesses. Phenomenology is the science that does this preeminently. In this sense, the natural scientist is completely right to follow the principle that for each claim relating to facts of nature, it is imperative to inquire into the experiences that justify it. Because that is a principle, it is a claim immediately drawn from a general discernment as we can convince ourselves at any moment by making perfectly clear to ourselves the sense of the expressions used in the principle and bringing to pure givenness the natural scientist. The scientist of essences has to follow a parallel principle, as does anyone who employs general propositions and asserts them. Moreover, there must be such a principle, since the principle just acknowledged is not itself experientially discernible, just as no principle or knowledge of essence is. So the principle itself is reflexive. In other words, how do we know the principle? Because of its givenness. Its givenness as essential to science. Now, there is mentioned that Heidegger writes about this a few places, and he suggests that the principle can't be theoretical because it's the basis for all the other principles. And there's something interesting about that, that then the question would be, what's the status of the principle that underlies the theoretical principles? For Heidegger, it's going to be something like being, but this is not addressed as such by Husserl. Husserl simply wants to drive home the point that the sciences of essences are sciences which follow the principle that all science has to follow, and that is to ground its theories in what is given and what is essentially given. That's all I had to say about this. If you have any comments or... Okay, I've got time. I can go on to the next section if you're willing to spend another 10 minutes with me. Yeah.
So I mostly read the sixth medical investigation and so on and so on. And you do not follow Husserl on the path toward transcendental philosophy, at least in the way he conceives it. So my question is there a way to persuade me to give credit to this text as an aggregate?
Yes, I think so. But I would do it by stressing the difference but complementarity of the two approaches. So what Husserl gives us is a way to explain theoretical disciplines on the basis of this phenomenological attitude, phenomenological reductions. What Husserl doesn't give us is an account of what it means for consciousness to be, or what it means for anything to be. He seems to be presupposing that the concept of being and the concept of being a conscious being, in both cases, is a kind of presence to us or presence to itself. From a Heideggerian point of view, that forfeits a lot about being that we need to say. Principally, absence, death, nothingness. There's a whole range of things that are as important to being as presence that Husserl doesn't address. Now, does that mean that there isn't a way to find some complementarity? I mean, the very fact that Husserl's talking about eidetic sciences and irrealities, that's not something Heidegger addresses. So I don't think that it's necessary that they would come apart. Now, if one is insistent that this is the only way to treat all the themes of phenomenology, then of course Heidegger's going to come along and say that can't be the case. But I would push complementarity rather than an exclusive disjunct. But that may be because I studied too much Hegel in my youth. But I want compromise. I want to find a reconciliation. But I think the reconciliation possibilities are there, but they're difficult, no doubt about it. I mean, Heidegger's, I think he's right that Husserl just doesn't talk about being. The categorical intuition that tells us that the exists is nice, and there is something to that. But what does existence mean there? That's not told to us. That's not elaborated. So there, I think he has something on him. There's other parts too. We'll not talk about it now. So we're going to talk about the natural attitude in a moment. And that's the next chapter. And the natural attitude is based upon perception. Perception is the key category of consciousness in terms of which we exist in the natural attitude. We perceive things in space and time that have a certain identity in space and time. And we do that through the senses, through sense perception. When you read what Husserl says, and we'll do this, he never says anything like, we see, instead of saying, I see that the chair is blue, or I see the blue chair. That would be Husserl's way of describing the natural attitude. Heidegger says, no. You see that there's something you can sit down on. He sees that the implement character of what is in our environment. And Husserl, that only comes after the fact that you have the perceptual. I mean, Heidegger, the fact that you see a world of implements, he thinks that that's already there in the Aristotelian view of things. You see things that are confused, and that's foreign to Husserl's account, or at least Husserl only brings it in after the fact. So he doesn't. Husserl says that the natural attitude includes we see things that have values and that are practical, but it's founded upon a conception of seeing that isn't a matter of seeing how they're used. I mean, everything in this room, except for you and me, the air we breathe, perhaps, is a tool. And we see it in terms of its usability. That's being in the world for Heidegger. And we have to abstract from that to say we perceive things in the way Husserl describes the natural attitude. So that's a difference. Okay, well, let's move to the natural attitude. I'll keep you 10 more minutes. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. So the natural attitude, all right, it'll take me a second. I go from Pisa 6 to Pisa 7. There it is. Pisa 7. The world of natural attitude, some ambiguities. The fundamental phenomenological consideration. That's the title of the second section. So this is, if you get this, you'll get a lot of what's happening in Ideas 1. The fundamental phenomenological consideration. It opens with a chapter entitled The Thesis of the Natural Attitude and its Suspension. The word thesis is taken from the Greek. It means to posit. It's what the world that is posited in the natural attitude. Husserl describes this as he's trying to describe how humans naturally live. There's that word natural again. how the world presents itself to humans, how they judge, feel, and will in a natural attitude. It's a little ambiguous here. One ambiguity is the world of the natural attitude. Does the world contain the natural attitude, or does the world belong to the natural attitude? So once again, that ambiguity, the genitive, needs to always be addressed. But at any rate, putting that ambiguity aside, Husserl writes that in the natural attitude, he is conscious of a world spread out in space, endlessly becoming and having become in time. He adds that he is conscious of it and that he immediately finds it intuitively. Without explanation, he speaks of various manners of sensory perception. He doesn't talk about using things. He's talking about various manners of sensory perception, thanks to which corporeal things in some sort of spatial distribution are simply here for me. So, think right now, the rest of the room is laid out in front of you, spatially configured, and it's going to be emptied in 20 minutes or 10 minutes. This is a temporal and spatial way in which the world is laid out for us in the natural attitude. Animals and other animals, animals and other humans with whom I converse and empathize are also immediately there for me in the natural attitude. So I'm there for you and you're there for me in the natural attitude. You perceive me, I perceive you. Thus, in the natural attitude, I am conscious of a world endlessly extended in spatial and temporal directions. And that world, in that world, things and people are literally and figuratively in expression vorhanden. So in the natural attitude, things are present to me, they're on hand. Now, Husserl introduces a little wrinkle here that is really terrific. It's a wonderful addition, I think. He introduces an aspect of perceptual experience for which he is justly renowned. He says that the perception may only be tacit as we move back and forth from tacit to explicit and back again. Okay, so look at me. Okay, explicitly you're looking at me. Tacitly you're seeing the wall behind me. You're seeing the walls on the side. You're seeing the floor. You're seeing the top. And you can say, I hate looking at Dahlstrom. I'm going to look at the floor now. And you can shift and look at that. But then I become part of your background. Husserl underscores this contextuality in the opening of this chapter. And it's really a powerful account. Okay? We can't think of perception just as we perceive an object. No, we perceive it against the background. And we perceive it against the background to which we can then shift attention. And then the object that was explicit becomes tacit, becomes part of that background. He calls this horizon. He actually uses an expression, the foggy horizon, because it's not so clear. It's kind of vague, but it's there. And we can always shift back and forth from it. He says what is explicitly perceived, what is more or less clearly co-present and determinate to some degree, is in part pervaded, in part surrounded by a horizon of indefinite actuality of which I am dimly conscious. And this holds for space as well as for time. This is also one of the obscurities of these German phenomenologists. Horizon's a metaphor, but it's being used here to do a lot of work. But one of the jobs it's being used to do is to explain time. So it's not just the spatial horizon that provides that indefinite, horizon of actuality. It's the temporal horizon. But it's easier to understand a temporal horizon, a spatial horizon than it is to understand a temporal horizon. I mean, we speak of horizon as, well, we can't see any further, or there's a limit to the end of what we can see, and that's spatial. But both Husserl and Heidegger apply the notion of horizon to temporality as well as the spatiality. So we've got a dual metaphor here. I mean, not only we're using horizon in a metaphorical sense, but now we're applying it to time, where it isn't so straightforward, obvious that it applies. That's another interesting, just use of that term here. But again, I think this is a real contribution of Husserl to call attention to this. It has something to do, obviously, with the development of Gestalt psychology at the time, but he brings it right into the account of the natural attitude. Okay, now here's a potential problem from a Heideggerian point of view. What is the world? Natural attitude. It sounds like the world is simply the collection of all the things that are present in it, that present themselves to it. That's not going to work for Heidegger. The world has to have a richer connotation than just simply being, well, the collection of all the things that are present in the natural attitude. Whether that can be fixed up or whether that's a problem, at least prima facie, it seems to be a problem. So at any rate, even if he does not equate the world with everything that is or can be present to the natural attitude, Husserl does not thematize the world as such. So that potential problem. He also doesn't explain whether an attitude is the ground level of consciousness. Remember, we're starting with attitude here. Natural attitude, phenomenological. It sounds like the attitude's ground level. Heidegger in 1919 says, wait a minute, you have to take on an attitude. Attitude can't be ground level. What's your attitude towards me? Well, before you have, you knew me or you took up a certain stance towards me, you had a certain way of relating. The attitude isn't ground level. That's one potential problem with Husserl's account that Heidegger jumps on. Okay. But again, I don't want to understate Husserl's accomplishment here. To his great credit, Husserl flags the rich contextual character of perception. His insight into this contextuality is noteworthy. It's even innovative, I think, partly given his subsequent observation. And for all of those who are working with McDowell and Dreyfus or any of these, just pay attention to this next point. Husserl observes that there is a cognition involved here that is non-conceptual. He says, this is his famous discussion of the natural attitude and sitting in his room. He says, from the desk that I have just seen and noted, I can let my attention wander out through the unseen parts of the room, behind my back to the veranda, into the garden, to the children in the bushes, and so forth, to all the objects of which I am immediately co-conscious. And then he says, a knowing that has nothing of conceptual thinking in it, and only changes into a clear intuiting when attention is turned toward it. And even then, only partially and mostly in a very imperfect manner. Well, that's remarkable. He has a non-conceptual kind of cognition that that's the expression he's using to characterize this awareness of our context, the horizons that are around us, temporal and spatial, for our perceptions. He also, anticipating Merleau-Ponty, he calls this a field of perception. And items within that field that I do not directly attend to form a horizon of indeterminate actuality. He says, the foggy horizon, never to be fully determined, is necessarily there, even when I don't pay attention to it. Okay. I have a little more to say about that, but I'll wait till next meeting. Any other questions? I mean, this opening section on the natural attitude is really, really well done, really interesting. So I recommend you look at. So next time, I will go through the natural attitude and its suspension. So we'll get to the notion of phenomenological reduction. Try to read with you as much as we can of the next few sections, particularly the region of pure consciousness, and then a chapter that is entitled Phenomenological Reductions. Phenomenological reductions are very controversial. Some people think, get rid of it. Other people think without it, you can't do phenomenology. So talk about it. Yes, Alfredo, or for post-professor Ferrarin.
You're off the hook. I think that I really need to ask you at least a couple of questions.
Sure.
One is, isn't it a bit unfair of Heidegger to criticize the principle of principles by reference to the necessity of presence, when it seems to me that this latest part that you commented on, but all of the genetic phenomenology in early 20s seems to actually speak in favor of a stratification of when it comes to time, when it comes to perception, when it comes to horizons, when it comes to consciousness. The actual is only the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much that is included in our consideration of whatever is at stake from time to time, that really it seems a bit reductionist to speak of presence in these terms. That's one question. Of course, we know that Heidegger knew what was the lectures on time consciousness, which he delayed the publication of for a number of years until Being and Time was out. He knew at least something of the lectures on passive synthesis and a number of themes that Husserl was developing in these years. But even if you only single out ideas one, what you just said seems to speak against that kind of hasty identification. That's one question. The other question is, I have actually thousands of questions about essence, but when you talk about ideation as the passage from the vision of the individual, the vision of the essence, and so on, that's all very, very well and good. But when you try to think more in detail what an essence is supposed to be like, first question I ask myself is, okay, I have an identification of an isosceles triangle. Fine. If I translate that into, let's say, classical Aristotelian metaphysics, I say, all right, I intuit the eidos. The properties are something else. The eidos is the foundation for everything else, including all predication of the properties. Sometimes it seems to me that Husserl is actually referring to something like that. But when you talk about the essence of red, or the essence of triangularity, it can be the same thing. Because you do not have, let's say, a model of intelligibility from which you start predicating properties and demonstrating what is necessary and what is not necessarily and not necessarily belonging to it, and so on.
Yeah, okay. The first question first, maybe I misrepresented it. Heidegger defends the principle of all principles. So he doesn't reject it, he defends it. But he defends it by saying that by not treating the principle of the rest of the principles as theoretical, he avoids the circularity that would be there if one did think of the principle of all principles as theoretical. So there's that he does, he's actually defending the principle of all principles, just as he sometimes defends the phenomenological reduction. As for the presence part, I think you're right, and I don't have any problems with that. I don't think that gets Husserl off the hook when it comes to the matter of being. I mean, he doesn't address it. And he seems not to address it because, I mean, there's the kinds of features that it requires us to think about. He doesn't want to talk about. So I'm willing to, and I'm not just willing, I'm eager to reconcile them on lots of levels. And I think you're right that this talk about the context and the presence and absence is there. But my quibble would be less a Derridian quibble with the metaphysics of presence than it would be the lack of a considered analysis of being in general and being the being of consciousness. So that's where I would go there. The other question is a really good one, and I'm not sure I can answer it very well, but I think what Husserl means by essence, even when he talks about the red or the triangularity, is something that is open to analysis and predication. Now, you may be right, that doesn't work for some of those, but that I'm not sure about. But I think that he himself would consider it, the fact that we have an eidos there, as something that we can analyze and talk about the properties of, either going upwards to what it is subsumed by and what falls under it. But I can't go any further with that than that. So, I mean, unless part of your point is that there's a way in which Aristotle articulates that he is not capable of reproducing but I don't know enough about that to go there.
I guess a different way to put this question would be, how undivided is an essence? In other words, are essences originally unitary, or can they be the result of further subordinated essences themselves? Because in Aristotle, it's clear that Aristotle, I take Aristotle as an example. No, the essence is the whole of them. It's an original whole.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to say about the essence, if you want to single out a part, it's a part of that whole, which is at the origin. And it seems to me that very often the way Husserl talks about ideation would go in that direction. That sometimes.
Well, could the problem be, I don't know the answer to this, but could the problem be the fact that sometimes he speaks in general terms and other times he's distinguishing formal ontology and material ontology? So that maybe the material ontology would include the predication, the predicability, and the formal ontology wouldn't necessarily, at least not in the same way. But I can't go further than that. It's a great question. It's the best I can do with this.
Can you see if there are any questions?
Does anybody who's long distance have a question? No, I guess not. You're still here, are you? Are you awake?
All right. Then there's someone in the chat. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Well, at that point, I think we're ready to go. Thank you for being with us. And
thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Dahlstrom, for this.
And thank you for the question.
For yet another very exciting lecture.